Okay, so now I just want to cover off the last few settings for rendering we haven't looked at. And so now going back to the rendering dialog box. So we have actually looked at most of this already, but I just want to finish off a few things that we haven't. So now I spent a bit of time explaining resolution, and that's especially important when you're starting to work with Photoshop and understand the image size. So again, just to remind you, on the image menu in Photoshop, when you go to image size, that basically is showing you the same thing. And so if I change it here to pixels, it's because it's in... okay, so if I change that to pixels, you can see there it's 2000 by roughly 2900. And back into Revit, when we look at the resolution or the output settings there, you can see it tells us the image size again in pixels. And that's probably the most important thing. When you're starting to work with rendered images, you need to get used to thinking of the size of the image in pixels, not in real-world units like millimeters. You'll tie it all back to that in the end, because when you've got the image size in pixels, and that's then combined with a resolution or a DPI setting, dots per inch, and it's nuts that we work with dots per inch even though we're working in millimeters. But luckily we don't have to do the maths. Revit does that for us. So when we set 150, based on this pixel size, we get 280 by 175 millimeters. Working back the other way, again 280 by 175 is the size, and do you remember how that's set in the view? That size in millimeters? Okay, that's probably where I should start actually. So when you come to here, it's very difficult to understand this printer setting until you know how you've set that size in millimeters. Because it's a perspective view, scale doesn't apply. So we set the size of our view, not by setting a scale, but by setting a size. And you set that by selecting the border of the perspective and going to size crop. So then you get the width and the height, again in millimeters. And I think we tried to relate this before to an A4 page. So that's a little bit smaller than an A4 page. And if I drag in the sides, also just cancel this, I can even just drag it in here. And then if I go back to size crop, you can see that's a little bit smaller, the width. So you might be starting to think about this almost as an aperture, which is also what it is. But it's important that you relate that back to a print size. And if you're only trying to change the print size, if you don't want to change the width or the height of that aperture, it's better to change the option there from field of view to scale. That way it's not going to change these views non-proportionally, it's going to change them with lock proportions. So if I change the height, let's say I change it to 160, I'm just going to click over to the left where it's got the width, and it will change in proportion, which means the view won't change on the screen. The relationship of the width and the height is still the same. And that's an important thing. So you're basically changing the size it would be when it's printed, whereas if you change the field of view, that will change non-proportionally, which means if I change the width here, I'll just do that. I'll make it 260, just as an example, and okay, and it will widen it. In other words, it's not in proportion anymore. And that can be useful, but normally when you're trying to change the size at the rendering stage, you just want to change the scale, again, so you keep it in proportion. And then once you understand what the print size is, and again, 260 by 160 over here, you can see, then you can relate that to the resolution that you require, which generally should be 300. And that will then give you the final pixel dimensions for the image, which is what you're going to work with once you go into Photoshop. and again, it's good to start relating this back to things that you're maybe more familiar with, and I always talk about TV screens at this point, but hopefully you can remember that. HD resolution and 4K resolution, all those things use the same approach to image size. Well, maybe before we finish, so do you think that's big? 3000 by 1890? Is that a big or high resolution image, do you think? Yeah, absolutely. 10 years ago, I would have thought that's beyond what we would even try to attempt. Now, because computers are a bit more powerful, we can do that. It's a little bit below 4K, so I know most people have 4K TV screens now because they're so cheap compared to a few years ago. But I remember not long ago, HD was a big thing. Just HD, TV screens were a big improvement, and that's much higher than HD. But still a little bit less than 4K. So that's kind of the ballpark you want to be in, generally above HD. Yeah, not, if you see dimensions like 10,000 by 7,000, you're way too high. And so the final thing there is the image size, and that's really what tells you how much processing power the computer needs to render. So you can probably tell already that the resolution has a big effect on the quality of your rendering. But then you've also got this setting for quality. So what does that do? And here you've got these presets, draft, medium and high. And I think I've been telling you to use just draft and medium to start with. So I'm going to go down to the edit button at the bottom, just so that you can see what this is actually setting. And to be able to adjust this, you've got to click copy to custom, and then you can actually change these settings. So if you go to advanced, then you're going to get more accurate materials and shadows, which I don't want to go into the technical aspects, but I'll mention one thing, which is it's called anti-aliasing, and that does, I think, have some effect, or there's a bit of an aliasing effect with materials, but mostly these lighting and material settings are to do with lighting and shadows. So that can improve the quality of your render, but also makes it take a lot longer. But then further down, you've got now just a simple slider. In the past, you could adjust and tweak a lot of different settings, but now, again, it's all been simplified, and you've just got that slider. Later, you'll see when we go into 3ds Max, you can actually see and adjust a lot more different settings, and we can get into things like aliasing and anti-aliasing, which is really what you're controlling here. And it's a real-life effect. I suppose not many of you are playing 3D computer games at all, or looking at the settings for those things. No. But if any of you who do, you might have seen that they have these settings for, again, what's called aliasing. And it's essentially that effect that you see often when you're going over maybe a bridge, and there are lots of parallel lines together, and they start to have that sort of strobing effect, that curving lines. And you'll see it in rendering when you've got brick textures or timber textures, and you get these annoying moire effects, is what they're called, where the curved lines go through your lines that should be nice and parallel. And that's basically one of the most common what's called aliasing effects. And that's what these things are filtering out. So it's hard to demonstrate now that they've simplified all the settings, so I might just very quickly bring up something in Google, just so you can get an idea of what it's doing. Because, I mean, aside from resolution, a lot of those other render settings are pretty technical. So let's see, anti-aliasing is the main one. And I'm sure here you're going to say, there we are. Okay, so that's the effect. You get this basically distortion of lines that should be straight because you're dealing with pixels. So when they're aliased, you get the pixels coming up, and essentially when they're anti-aliased, they blur those edges, which can make them look smoother and more straight. And yeah, so there's some good examples of it. hoping they'd have some with the parallel lines, and you can see the Moyo effect. There we are, so you can see there, if you look in the distance, notice how on the one on the left, it's got those lines coming through. There's still a bit of it on the right, but it's much better on the right. And it's not because the one on the right is higher resolution, it's because of that, again, that anti-aliasing render correction. And so there are lots of technical settings like that that basically go into these render quality settings. So that's what the quality option does for you. So the problem though, when you go to high, this is just a technical thing with the render engine that Revit uses. Because it goes to the advanced lighting materials, it can actually give maybe undesirable effects for rendering. Try it out. For some spaces and some scenes it works pretty well. But I've seen often it looks worse than medium. Yeah, it's weird. Yeah. It's annoying. So I think they're just not going to bother getting it to work properly with Revit, because I think they just expect you to go to 3ds Max if you're going to be doing that level of rendering. And in 3ds Max you can definitely adjust all the settings to make it work properly. But yeah, if you've seen it do strange things when you go to high, then that's not unusual. So I'd recommend just stick to medium. Try high if you have the time, and you might be lucky and get it to do some good things for you, but otherwise, yeah, medium's fine. So that's it. And then if I click render, of course, it's going to render with those settings. So that's all fine. But also notice that I've got the lighting scheme set to my artificial only, and I've got the background setting there as well. So the next thing I'm going to show you is the cloud rendering options that you have. Yeah, best is just like high, but with even higher settings, if that makes sense. So if we go and have a look at it, so you can see it's basically the same as high, but with, I think, this slider dragged up a bit high, that's all, yeah. So, yeah, and look, honestly, I reckon if you're going to be trying best, then 3ds Max is a better option, yeah. So, if you're going to use the next thing, which is a brilliant thing in Revit, and also you have this option in 3ds Max, to render in cloud. And if you haven't tried that, I'd recommend trying it straight away. It's a brilliant, brilliant thing. And to use it though, you need to be signed into your Autodesk account. It's often best to sign in advance. So up here you can just click sign in and then choose, again, sign into Autodesk 360. And it's working. There we are. So I'm signed in, and now I can click Render in Cloud. Just click Continue here, and then. So what I normally recommend is that you just change the render quality to final, even for your first time, and then the image size you can see just comes up in megapixels. So you can't set the pixel dimensions in the same way as you do in the render dialog box. It just has these basic preset settings. But you'll see when you open it in Photoshop, then you can see what the dimensions are. So it's a bit of guesswork there at first to get the right image size, but I'd probably recommend at first that you start at least on large, and then you might want to go to extra large, or even maximum later. But they're going to use more credits. And now if you're using a student account or an educational license, you've got unlimited credits. If you've got a commercial license, you don't, you've got to pay for them, and I have to pay for these. But again, as students, you get all the credits unlimited for free, but I think there's a daily limit. So if you use too many credits in a day, then you might have to wait another day to render again. So I'll just put that on large for now. And for testing, yeah, 2 credits is fine. That's it. The exposure, those options both can be useful, but at first probably just leave it on advanced. And So I'll just let that go through. You can click continue in background, but it usually goes pretty quickly even without clicking on that. And so if you're wondering how does it know what lighting settings to use, well, that's why I showed you the rendering dialog box before, because it uses those settings that you have here for your lighting when you go to rendering cloud, even if you're not rendering here. So then to see my render, up next to that rendering cloud button, you've got the button to go to render gallery. And that will just open up your default browser. Oh god, here it's Edge. Anyhow, I'll live with it. There we are. So it should take me straight to my own page. And you can see, you know, all the other renders I've done in class. And so here's the one I've just done. It looks like it's finished already. Oh no, here we go, it's in the queue. But it is rendering, it says 2 hours, it's not going to take that long. Usually about 10-15 minutes at most for one of this quality. Are you sure? Yes, yeah, Cloud is, that's right. Yeah, it's off in Singapore. They used to send it off to America, but now they've got them all around the world. And so our head office is, yeah, in Singapore, and it renders them all in this massive render farm they've got there. Oh yeah, yeah, all goes in a queue. But I wouldn't worry if we've got the whole class using it, that's not going to make too much difference because they've got thousands of people sending it to the cloud service and all rendering. And yeah, so they've got supercomputers there that can handle all of this, and yeah, it's usually fine. Yeah, sure. Yep. Yep. No, the look of the render won't be any different depending on the computer, but the time will be. So if you're rendering locally with that previous one, where you just click, you know, when you click render here, that's using your computer to render. So the speed is dependent on the power of your computer. But when you're rendering, that's right, exactly, the quality is independent. So, but when you're using rendering cloud, I mean, I've often done it on my tablets even. So I can open Revit files on one of my tablets. That's a Windows one. Revit barely works on that tablet, but I can open my files and then send them off to rendering cloud, and it works perfectly because it's using someone else's computer to do all the work. And that's the brilliant thing about the cloud. Oh yes, yeah. But I mean, it's just going to upload part of the file. It doesn't upload the whole file. So for rendering, it just uploads what it needs for that particular view. But yeah, it does, yeah, need the connection. Oh, but that's just your internet connection. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there can be large files. Yeah, if you choose extra large, they probably will be fairly big. They might be, I don't know, maybe 20 meg at most, something like that. I think the biggest I've seen might have been 100 meg. Yeah. So yeah, it'll take longer than an email, but still, it's not as bad as downloading a full 3D model or something like that. Yeah. So I'll go back now, and yeah, it's still going, so I'm going to leave that one, but I'll just go back and show you one that's already been completed. And so there's the Tamar Valley one, which I'll just open up. Why isn't that opening? So it's just, that's why I don't like Edge. It's so frustrating. Yeah, yeah. That's right, yeah, so it's going through. But it's dark, and so what I wanted to show you is you can adjust the exposure after it's rendered, which is a really nice thing. And yeah, normally it's really easy to open these, but I think because it's Edge, which is not a very good browser, I think, I'm just going to show you. You can easily switch browsers. If you select the, you know, the address bar there, just copy that path. When you right-click, you can copy. And then I'm going to open up a better browser. Well, not better. Chrome's got its own problems, but it's better for this. And so going into the address bar, I'm just going to right click and paste and go. And then it'll of course just open up the same page with Chrome. And, oh, it wants me to log in, that's fine. There we go. See, that's what should happen. You can just click on them to open them. So I'll go back to that Tamar Valley and so it's finished. Yeah. Okay, so that's very warm and it's not that dark, but maybe I just want to make it a little bit brighter. So up here you've got the adjust exposure button, that one with the plus and minus. And it does work in real time. So if I drag the slider here to make it brighter, you can see the results straight away. Maybe I want to make it a bit less warm as well, so I'll try and change the white point value there and bring that down so it's a bit cooler. There we go, that's better. Maybe that's a bit too cool, I want a bit of warmth, but not as much. There we go. So that's the change I wanted, and now I'm just going to click apply, and it does have to process that again. So it'll go through, it's like a mini render. It doesn't take as long as a full render, but you have to wait for it. So there we go, that's done. So that's it. So it's a little bit different to when you render locally. You can adjust exposure in there and see the results straight away. But with the cloud, you just need to, again, wait for that, that little processing to happen, and otherwise, pretty straightforward. So there we go, I can see the previous one there as well. And now I can go back and see if the other one's finished. Oh yeah, now it's finished. Oh no, it's not, so it's still going. But getting there. Final. So there's only two. There's just normal and final. And then, yeah, I think I did large for the image size. Yeah. So you can see that, well, maybe you can't tell, but it actually does a lot of the lighting automatically. It cheats. And this is why some of the professional renderers, people who do this work for a living, they don't really like this rendering program, not because it doesn't look good, but because it puts in extra lights. And they think that's cheating, or they don't get the control they want, because it's putting in sometimes thousands of extra point lights everywhere to balance out the lighting for you, which is actually a good thing most of the time. So that's a nice thing, and there's something that you don't get with the local render. When you render locally, you need to do all of the work setting up the lights. But again, with the cloud, it won't fix everything, so I've got these dark areas in the background, but it has balanced the lighting out a lot more than what I'd have back here if I set that to, let's just do this one. So it's a nice option, and I've seen some people who have done very little setup in their files, and just a minimal amount of lighting with some simple materials get beautiful results with the cloud, because it automatically will do a lot of things for you. It does, yeah. It is, yeah. It is different, yeah. That's a good point, yeah. It does, yeah. It's just different. It's a different rendering program. I think probably most of the time it is better. But if it's a complex scene, if there's lots of complex geometry or complex textures, and especially if you've got unusual lighting, then it can give some unusual results. And then the local one maybe can be better. But they're different programs. So, yeah. Oh yeah, of course, yeah, sure. That's all I wanted to show you. So I thought this one might start. You can see it's still black, so I won't wait for that. Yeah, but I'll finish there. So that should give you enough. I think, I just wanted to make sure that you've got some idea about some of those technical things, and so I'll finish up just showing you the program here. So a lot of these other things I can't really show you in Revit. We need to look at 3ds Max for some of those other settings. So we'll see how we go for time. We don't really have to do that for this assignment, so we might even come back to that later. But if you're interested, I can show you today. Otherwise, we'll look at that later on. And actually, maybe I'll just point out this last thing, which used to be one of my favourite things, indirect illumination. And I used to use that a lot. I still do with V-Ray and Corona, because you can control what's called the bounce lighting, or again, the indirect illumination. And that used to be one of the most important technical render settings. In the early days of rendering, they didn't have it at all. So if you were rendering with an early version of 3ds Max, the light didn't bounce. So you had to put in extra lights, so when the light was coming through a window, it'd hit the floor, and then it wouldn't bounce to hit the wall. So the walls would be black, even though you'd have bright sunlight on the floor. And you'd have to stick extra lights in the scene to simulate the bounced lighting. But then with the newer programs, they gave you lots of settings to control that bounced lighting, and you could actually get beautiful renders just with one light source, say outside your room, and then you could tweak the bounce light settings, or the indirect settings, and get extra bounce light into your space without having to put lots of lights around. And that was a brilliant thing. You can still do it with V-Ray, but with this new rendering program you've got in Revit, ART, that also you have in 3ds Max, they've hidden and made those settings hard to get to. I think they thought it was too technical. So, yeah, I still want to try and show that to you at some point, but it's something that's much harder to get to now, unfortunately. But if you ever get to use V-Ray or Corona, that's a big thing in those programs as well, that idea of indirect illumination. And all these things you can probably tell already with rendering are based on the way light works, and so the more you do these things, the better your understanding of the way light works in the real world will probably be as well. And it's what got me, I've always been interested in those things, but optics is something that I've had to learn a lot about since learning rendering, and that's been a really interesting thing for me as well. And, well, there we are. So you can see here, this is very dark, and I'd need to go, make some big changes to the exposure there. Don't know what's going on there, but I can fix that. And we'll come back to that later. So, again, I might just stop that one. Yes, and it's even disappeared. If I go and adjust the exposure, then it's probably not even going to work, is it? No. Anyway, we'll come back to that. It's a shame that it's finishing there, but I'll start that again later.